The air inside is thick enough to choke on. Beneath your boots, the volcanic rock floor is slick with condensation and something darker, machine oil, human waste, the residue of 3 years spent entombed in stone. Your flashlight beam cuts through darkness so complete it feels solid, revealing steel rails disappearing into the mountain's belly, and along the walls, the scratches, thousands of them, tally marks carved by men who knew they were being buried alive. This is Rabaul, 1945. The Japanese garrison here has been encircled for over a year, cut off, starving, forgotten by their own command, but they haven't surrendered. Instead, they've dug. Miles of tunnels honeycomb these cliffs, and inside them waits something the Allied forces never anticipated: a subterranean fortress so vast, so meticulously constructed, that it will rewrite the rulebook on siege warfare and force military planners to confront an uncomfortable truth. Determination and engineering can turn defeat into defiance and isolation into survival. What Allied troops discover here will haunt military strategists for generations. Before we descend further into those depths, if you're captivated by the untold stories of World War II's most astonishing theaters, subscribe now. History this gripping deserves to be shared. Rabaul sits at the northeastern tip of New Britain Island in Papua New Guinea, overlooking a harbor formed by the collapsed caldera of an ancient volcano. In 1942, the Japanese seized it from a small Australian garrison and immediately recognized its strategic gold mine. The harbor could shelter an entire fleet. The surrounding airfields, eventually 5 of them, could project power across the Bismarck archipelago, threatening Australia itself and dominating the Solomons. Within months, Rabaul became the Gibraltar of the Southwest Pacific, headquarters of the Japanese 8th Area Army under General Hitoshi Imamura, and home to over 100,000 troops, sailors, and laborers. Supply convoys flowed in, aircraft staged through constantly. For 2 years, Rabaul was untouchable. Then the Allies changed the game. In 1943, General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral William Halsey launched their island-hopping campaign, bypassing heavily fortified positions to seize weaker targets, cutting supply lines, and leaving Japanese garrisons to wither. Rabaul, once the beating heart of Japanese operations, became a strategic dead end. Allied air forces pounded it relentlessly. Over 20,000 tons of bombs eventually fell on the base, while the Navy blockaded the sea approaches. By early 1944, Rabaul was isolated, its airfields cratered, its harbor a graveyard of sunken vessels. The garrison couldn't be reinforced. It couldn't be evacuated. It could only endure. Most military historians expected collapse, cut off from resupply, facing starvation and disease, surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces. The garrison should have negotiated surrender or disintegrated into chaos. Neither happened. Instead, the Japanese dug in with an intensity that bordered on obsession. They turned the volcanic mountains into fortresses, carving out a hidden world beneath the jungle canopy. When Allied reconnaissance pilots photographed the area, they saw abandoned airstrips and bombed-out buildings. They didn't see the truth. Understanding what happened at Rabaul requires understanding the Japanese military mindset of 1944. The doctrine of Gyokusai, death before dishonor, fighting to the last man, had become codified after the losses at Guadalcanal and Tarawa. Surrender was not merely forbidden, it was culturally unthinkable, a betrayal of the emperor, family, and ancestors. Japanese officers drilled into their men that capture meant torture and death, that the Americans would defile their bodies and dishonor their spirits. This wasn't just propaganda. Many Japanese soldiers genuinely believed it, having witnessed their own military's brutality and projecting it onto the enemy. But the Rabaul garrison wasn't simply waiting to die gloriously. General Imamura was a pragmatist, educated and respected even by Allied officers who later met him. He understood that his force couldn't break the siege, couldn't win, couldn't even inflict meaningful damage on the enemy, but he could survive. He could keep his men alive, maintain discipline, and deny the Allies the satisfaction of conquest. If the war turned, if Japan somehow achieved a negotiated peace, an intact garrison at Rabaul would be a bargaining chip. If not, at least his men would die on their own terms, not starved into submission. The volcanic terrain provided the solution. Rabaul's mountains were composed of relatively soft, tough, compressed volcanic ash that could be carved with hand tools. The Japanese had engineers, skilled miners among the labor troops, and above all, time. They began tunneling. Not simple dugouts or bunkers, but an entire underground city designed for long-term survival and defense. The scale defied belief. Work crews, often operating at night to avoid air attacks, excavated complexes that extended hundreds of meters into the mountainsides. The main tunnel networks at places like Mount Vulcan and the Vunakanau area featured multiple levels connected by stairways and shafts. Chambers large enough to park trucks were hollowed out for supply depots, command posts, barracks, and hospitals. Narrow-gauge railways were laid to move materials and wounded. Ventilation shafts, some disguised as natural fissures, brought in air. Drainage channels prevented flooding during the tropical downpours. Blast doors, fabricated from salvaged steel, protected key junctions. The tunnels weren't crude shelters. They were engineered installations, planned and constructed with military precision. The labor was backbreaking. Men worked in shifts around the clock, digging with picks, shovels, even bare hands when tools wore out. Dynamite and explosives, carefully hoarded, were used sparingly to break through harder rock layers. Dust filled lungs. Cave-ins killed workers, but the digging never stopped. Officers led by example, swinging picks alongside enlisted men. Imamura himself inspected the tunnels regularly, sleeping in them to boost morale, sharing the same meager rations as privates. The message was clear. They were all in this together, and the tunnels meant survival. As the blockade tightened, food became the garrison's obsession. Japan had never planned for Rabaul to be self-sufficient. The base consumed imported rice, canned goods, and fresh supplies brought by convoy. When those stopped arriving, the garrison faced starvation. Imamura responded with brutal practicality. Every scrap of arable land was turned into vegetable gardens. Troops planted sweet potatoes, tapioca, and taro in jungle clearings. They fished the coastal waters at night, risking Allied PT boat patrols. They foraged for wild sago palms, whose starchy pith could be processed into a barely edible paste. Livestock, pigs, chickens brought in before the siege, were slaughtered and strictly rationed. Even rats and insects became protein sources. The official ration dropped to a fraction of what soldiers needed, and men lost weight steadily, their uniforms hanging loose, their energy sapped. Yet discipline held. There are no documented instances of mutiny or widespread desertion from the Rabaul garrison. Hunger gnawed, but it didn't break them. Disease was the other relentless enemy. Malaria was endemic in New Britain's jungles. Without quinine or adequate medical supplies, malaria patients suffered recurring fevers, delirium, and organ failure. Dysentery swept through units, spread by contaminated water. Beriberi, caused by vitamin deficiency, left men with swollen limbs and damaged nerves. Tropical ulcers, infected cuts that wouldn't heal in the humid climate, ate through skin and muscle. The garrison's medical staff worked miracles with almost nothing, reusing bandages, performing surgeries without anesthesia, improvising treatments from local plants. The death toll from disease far exceeded combat casualties, and the bodies piled up faster than they could be buried or cremated. Yet the garrison endured. The tunnels became their salvation and their prison. During air raids, which occurred almost daily, thousands of men would retreat underground, waiting in the darkness, while bombs shook the earth above. The tunnels absorbed the punishment the surface couldn't. Direct hits occasionally collapsed sections, burying men alive, but the network was extensive enough that no single attack could cripple it. Supplies, ammunition, and equipment were stored deep inside, safe from destruction. Command centers operated by lantern light, maps spread on makeshift tables, officers coordinating patrols and agriculture projects and rationing schedules in a war that had become entirely about not losing. The Allies knew the Japanese were there, of course. Intelligence estimates pegged the garrison's strength at between 60 and 90,000 men in late 1944. Allied commanders debated what to do. An amphibious assault would be costly. The terrain favored defenders, and the Japanese had clearly fortified their positions, but leaving them alone felt inadequate, a threat unresolved. The compromise was containment. Australian forces, primarily the 5th Division under Major General Alan Ramsey, took over responsibility for monitoring Rabaul in late 1944. Their orders: watch the Japanese, prevent any breakout attempts, but don't assault the main positions. The Australians established outposts on the surrounding ridges and coastal areas, patrolling aggressively, skirmishing with Japanese foraging parties, and slowly tightening the noose. It was a siege in the oldest sense, a waiting game. For the Japanese soldiers, life became a monotonous grind of survival, punctuated by sudden violence. Patrols sent out to gather food or gather intelligence clashed with Australian units in brief, vicious firefights in the jungle. Men who ventured too far risked ambush. Allied artillery occasionally shelled suspected Japanese positions, but without good intelligence on the tunnels, most shells hit empty jungle or abandoned surface structures. Psychological warfare entered the mix. Allied loudspeakers broadcast surrender appeals in Japanese, promising food and medical care. Almost no one accepted. The cultural stigma was too powerful, the indoctrination too deep. To surrender was to cease being Japanese, to become something shameful and subhuman. Most soldiers preferred slow starvation to that dishonor. As 1945 arrived, the war's end was approaching, though the Rabaul garrison had no way to know it. Radio communications were intermittent, relying on patched-together equipment and dwindling power supplies. Official dispatches from Tokyo became rare, then stopped. Rumors circulated. Allied victories in the Philippines, the firebombing of Japanese cities, whispers of new superweapons. But concrete information was scarce. The garrison existed in informational isolation, fighting a war that had moved on without them. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, followed by Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast on August 15th, should have ended it. But the message took days to reach Rabaul reliably, and when it did, many officers refused to believe it. Surrender? The Emperor ordering surrender? It seemed like enemy propaganda, a cruel trick. Imamura himself struggled with the decision. His entire military career, his honor, his identity, had been built on the principle that Japan never surrendered. Now, the emperor himself was instructing him to lay down arms. The cognitive dissonance was shattering. Negotiations stretched through late August and into September. Australian commanders, approaching cautiously, made contact with Japanese officers under white flags. The talks were tense. The Japanese insisted on certain conditions: that their officers retain swords as symbols of rank, that the surrender be framed as an armistice rather than a defeat, that the troops be treated with respect. The Australians, aware that tens of thousands of armed fanatical soldiers still occupied fortified positions, agreed to most demands. On September 6, 1945, in a formal ceremony, General Imamura surrendered the Rabaul garrison. It was one of the last significant Japanese forces to capitulate. The numbers were staggering. The Australians documented over 86,000 Japanese personnel at Rabaul when the surrender took effect: soldiers, sailors, airmen, and laborers. Thousands more had died during the siege from disease, starvation, and Allied action, but far fewer than expected. The garrison had kept itself alive against impossible odds. Then the Australians entered the tunnels. The first patrols to descend into the underground complexes reported back in shock. They'd expected caves and crude shelters. Instead, They found a subterranean world, tunnels stretched for miles, branching into chambers that housed entire companies. The main complexes had electric lighting wired from salvaged generators, though most had run out of fuel months earlier. There were barracks carved into the rock, sleeping platforms tiered along the walls where hundreds of men had lived in the darkness. There were storerooms still stocked with rusting equipment, artillery pieces disassembled and cached, crates of ammunition, uniforms, helmets, personal effects left behind as the garrison finally emerged into the light. The hospitals were the most haunting. Operating theaters lit by skylights carved through thin sections of rock, surgical tables improvised from scavenged wood, instruments cleaned and reused until they were barely functional. Burial chambers, where bodies had been interred when the surface was too dangerous or when disease overwhelmed the cremation capacity. Shrines, small altars with offerings left by men praying for survival or an honorable death. The walls were covered with inscriptions, names, units, dates, poems, final messages to families these men believed they'd never see again. Allied engineers marveled at the construction. The tunnels were structurally sound, reinforced at key points with timber supports and concrete salvaged from destroyed buildings. The ventilation system worked. Air circulated even in the deepest chambers. The drainage prevented flooding despite the island's heavy rainfall. This wasn't desperate improvisation. It was military engineering executed with limited resources but unlimited determination. One Australian officer wrote in his report, "These people were not defeated, they were outlasted." The psychological impact on Allied planners was profound. Rabaul demonstrated that a well-led, ideologically motivated force could survive isolation indefinitely if properly prepared. The tunnels made conventional assault prohibitively expensive. Attackers would have had to fight room by room through kilometers of fortified underground passages, facing ambushes, booby traps, and defenders with nothing to lose. The siege strategy had been correct, but unsettling. If other Japanese garrisons adopted similar tactics, and intelligence suggested they were, the endgame of the Pacific War could become a nightmare of attrition. This realization contributed to the decision-making around using atomic weapons. The prospect of fighting similar sieges on the Japanese home islands was unthinkable. For the Japanese survivors, liberation was bitter. They were transported to POW camps, where for the first time in years they received adequate food and medical care. Many were skeletal, weighing barely half their pre-war mass. Disease and malnutrition had left permanent damage. Weakened hearts, damaged vision, chronic digestive issues, psychological trauma. Repatriation to Japan took months. When they finally returned home, many found their country devastated, their families dead or displaced, their sacrifice barely acknowledged in the national shame of defeat. General Imamura faced war crimes charges. While not accused of the atrocities committed by some Japanese commanders, he was held responsible for the harsh treatment of Allied POWs and forced laborers in the region. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, which he served with the same stoic discipline he'd shown at Rabaul. Released in 1954, he spent his remaining years in quiet reflection, maintaining that his duty had been to his men and his emperor, and that he'd fulfilled both. The tunnels themselves became a memorial and a curiosity. After the war, most were sealed or collapsed for safety, but several major complexes were preserved. Today, visitors can walk through sections of the Rabaul tunnels, flashlight in hand, retracing the steps of men who lived underground for over a year. The scratch marks are still visible on the walls. Rusted equipment still sits in the chambers. The air still tastes of stone and time. Military historians study Rabaul as a case study in siege endurance and the limits of aerial bombardment. The Allies dropped thousands of tons of ordnance on the base, but never broke it, because the real garrison was hidden beneath the surface. It influenced Cold War thinking about hardened facilities and underground command centers. The North Vietnamese would later employ similar tunnel networks during the Vietnam War with devastating effectiveness, proving that Rabaul's lessons had been learned. But beyond the tactical and strategic analysis lies the human story. Over 80,000 men spent months, many over a year, cut off from the world, starving, diseased, convinced they would die far from home. They didn't surrender, they didn't collapse. They dug into the earth and endured. Whether one views their determination as heroic or tragic or simply human depends on perspective. What's undeniable is the raw capacity for suffering and survival it represents. War demands this from young men, soldiers on every side, in every conflict, pushed to the edge of what bodies and minds can endure. The Japanese at Rabaul faced starvation and isolation. The Australians outside faced the knowledge that their enemy was trapped, suffering, yet still dangerous, still capable of inflicting casualties. Neither side could simply walk away. Both were bound by duty, by orders, by circumstances larger than any individual. This is the machinery of war, grinding through lives with indifferent efficiency. The veterans who survived Rabaul on both sides carried it forever. The Japanese soldiers returned to a defeated nation that wanted to forget the war, where speaking of military service brought shame rather than honor. Many never talked about Rabaul, never described the tunnels or the hunger or the friends buried in volcanic rock. They lived quiet lives, the memories locked away like the sealed tunnels themselves. The Australians who conducted the siege and took the surrender faced their own demons. The guilt of relative safety while watching an enemy waste away. The relief that they didn't have to assault those tunnels and die in the darkness. The haunting question of whether containment was mercy or cruelty. There are no easy answers in war. Rabaul proves that. You can be technically defeated, cut off, starving, unable to affect the war's outcome, and still not be beaten. You can dig tunnels miles deep and build a fortress underground and still lose. You can follow orders perfectly, maintain discipline, sacrifice everything, and it still might not matter. The war ended not because of Rabaul, but in spite of it. The garrison's endurance changed nothing strategically, yet it changed everything for the men who lived through it. So, what did they find in the tunnels of Rabaul? They found evidence of human beings pushed past the breaking point who refused to break. They found engineering that turned desperation into survival. They found inscriptions on stone walls written by men who believed they were carving their own epitaphs. They found the stubborn, terrible will that allows people to endure the unendurable, not from glory or heroism, but from duty and fear, and the simple refusal to stop. They found proof that war is never just about weapons and tactics, but about what human beings will do when given no choice but to dig deeper, literally and metaphorically, into the darkness. The tunnels remain, silent now, a monument to endurance without victory, survival without salvation, and the cold mathematics of siege warfare where time is the ultimate weapon. The men who carved them are gone, but the stone remembers every pickaxe strike, every desperate breath, every day that stretched into night beneath the earth. That memory, preserved in volcanic rock, is what they found, and it should shock us, not because it's extraordinary, but because it's not. This capacity for suffering, for holding on when there's no reason left to hold on, lives in us all. The tunnels of Rabaul just prove it, carved in stone and shadow, waiting for anyone brave enough to descend and look.